weeks exploring John's Gospel. This week we're going to be looking at John chapter 15 and then verses 18 through to chapter 16, verse 15. So it's quite a long section, but it's a really important one because remember, it comes after the I am saying. The I am saying, which is I am the true vine. And essentially it's about saying, well, why is that important? Why is the true vine important? And I think it'll explain something to us as we go through it. Let's listen to it together. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you in this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. As it is, they have seen, and yet they have hated both me and my Father. But this is to fulfill what is written in their law. They hated me without reason. When the advocate comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who goes out from the Father, he will testify about me. And you also must testify, for you have been with me from the beginning. All this I have told you so that you will not fall away. They will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. They will do such things because they have not known the Father or me. I have told you this so that when their time comes, you will remember that I warned you about them. I did not tell you this from the beginning because I was with you. But now I'm going to him who sent me. None of you asks me, where are you going? Rather, you are filled with grief because I have said these things. But very truly I tell you, it is for your good that I'm going away. Unless I go away, the advocate will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. When he comes, he will prove the world to be wrong about sin, righteousness, and judgment. About sin, because people do not believe in me. About righteousness, because I'm going to the Father, where you can see me no longer. And about judgment, because the prince of this world now stands condemned. I have much more to say to you, more than you can now bear. When he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all truth. He will not speak on his own. He will speak only what he hears, and he will tell you what is yet to come. He will glorify me, because it is from me that he will receive what he will make known to you. All that belongs to the Father is mine. That is why I said the Spirit will receive from me what he will make known to you. In some ways, this is quite a complicated passage. And I'm sure it's one that you've never heard preached because it's not on the lectionary schedule for most places. And I think the other reason why it's not actually preached about often is because of the emotions that are within it. It's actually a very emotional passage. You can almost hear the desperation of Jesus, that sense of saying he's going away and he's going to be leaving the disciples. And he knows that, in fact, what he's going to be leaving them to is not going to be a bed of roses. It's not going to be a land of milk and honey. It's actually going to be a difficult place. And in a sense, he's almost showing forth his concern and I suppose just the emotions that he has for his disciples at this particular point. He's going to leave, but he's also going to send them the Holy Spirit. And so for us, as we read this, we've got a sense of saying, hang on a second, there's more here There's more that we're wanting to understand from Jesus. And you can see even in the disciples themselves that he says, you haven't even asked any questions because you're so filled with grief. And I think in that sense, this passage is an amazing passage of acknowledging Jesus' love for us, that he doesn't want to leave us that way, but he doesn't want us to be grieving the situation that we're in. And yet at the same time, we're also seeing the answer to that and the connections with it. So I'd like you to spend some time thinking through the passage as we've read it. What strikes you as interesting? How do you feel the emotions within it? And what emotions does it actually bring up for yourself as you hear it and as you read it? Welcome back. This is now the second section that we've seen about the advocate, about the Holy Spirit. And in this section, you'll see that there's two more, I suppose you could call them two more activities that the Holy Spirit will do. Again, notice that John uses the word advocate. Sometimes it can be translated as counselor or companion, depending on which translation that you may use. But the idea with it is, it's the word again, the Greek word, paraclete or parakletos is the actual Greek word. And para mean, of course, alongside, and kletos to speak or to stand alongside us. And the Holy Spirit will stand alongside us. Now, the important thing here in terms of understanding this symbol of the Holy Spirit, or this concept that the Holy Spirit is going to do within this passage, is that you need to see where this passage comes in terms of its context. The first thing is that, of course, it follows on from the true vine. And as we were saying last week, that's the seventh of the I am sayings, the final link in the chain of discipleship. And of course, that link connects us to the community. Just like you have the grapevine, you've got that we grafted into Israel, we grafted into Christ, we grafted together as a community of Christ. And the reason why we can be disciples is because we're not doing it by ourselves, but we're doing it together. But the interesting thing, though, is that out of that community, if we're going to be a community of God, if we're going to stand against the things of the world, if we're going to stand against some of the ways in which the world is working, then unfortunately what's going to happen is there's going to be some blowback. There's going to be some response to that. And we'll talk about that later on in the study. But in the midst of how do we then survive as a community? How does that community work together? How do we remain in the vine? Well, again, Jesus' answer to that is the advocate, is the Holy Spirit. That the work of the Holy Spirit is to bind us together. The work of the Holy Spirit is to keep us together. And he's going to do that in terms of this passage in two particular ways. The first way is the one that talks about in verse 26, which says that then advocate comes, whom I send, he will testify about me. He will testify about me. And so you can see again, it's continuing this legal language of the advocate, an advocate who will testify about me. So in a court of law where the Holy Spirit will actually be the one who would then tell us about who Jesus is, the one who would connect us to Jesus. I think that it's absolutely essential for us, if we're going to be the community of Christ, that we know who Christ is. You know, too often what's happened, if you look at the history of Christianity, is that too often who we found out who Christ wasn't from the Holy Spirit, but from the world around us. That in many ways we've fashioned who Jesus is by virtue of the world and what the world would say he is. Sometimes as a warrior, as we see in someone like, for example, Constantine, that when Emperor Constantine was fighting to become the emperor of the Roman Empire, he fashioned Christ in a form that would enable him to actually further his martial perspectives, his violent perspectives. And so instead of actually allowing the Holy Spirit to tell him who Jesus is, in fact, what he did was he took his own context, he took his own environment, he took his own need and refashioned Christ to fill that need. You see, I think that one of the greatest reasons why the church no longer is in a place of superiority within, or even majority rather, within the West, is because of the fact that instead of the Holy Spirit testifying to who he is, we've allowed the world to testify to who he is. And we've created a Christ who is completely unlike the Christ of the Bible. He's unlike the Christ that, in fact, the Holy Spirit would want to testify to us about. When we look at the testimony of the Holy Spirit, is to tell us who Christ is, so that when we connect to him, when we follow him, when we seek to do what he did, we actually would know who he is. If we don't know who he is, why would we remain within the vine? The second image that comes out of the application, or at least the concept or the symbol of the advocate, is the one which says that he will guide us into truth. It says in verse 13 of chapter 16, it says, when he comes, the Spirit of truth, he will guide you into all truth. He will guide you into all truth. I think this is such an important aspect of what the Holy Spirit does to help us remain together as a community. You know, our world has become complicated. There's so many things that we can do now through science and through technology. There's so many things that we are able to do. But the question should always be not are we able, but should we? Should we do those things? And that's really the tricky part, isn't it? When we look at the ways in which we now talk about sexuality or orientation, the way in which we talk about gender, the way in which we talk about equity in terms of demographics and perspectives, the way in which we talk about issues of ethnicity and tribal realities and so on, and ancient religion and the way in which those should connect with us and so on. There's so many things in our world right now where we ask ourselves, what should we do? Some of you may remember that at one point, maybe a few decades ago, there was a craze amongst Christian bookshops of a little band, an armband called "What Would Jesus Do?" And that was always a big question, isn't it? What would Jesus do? Well, that's part of the work of the Holy Spirit, is to guide us into truth. Is to guide us into truth. That's part of the whole point of the Holy Spirit's work, is that the Holy Spirit will help us to actually figure out what is it, to discern what is God's will, what is God's purpose, what is God's perspective. Again, too often, in fact, our decision making is by virtue of what's good for us, maybe even good for our churches, instead of asking ourselves, what is it that Jesus actually wants us to do? In this passage, it tells us that the Holy Spirit will guide us into truth. How does he do that? How does that work? Maybe spend some time talking about that. Talk about those two aspects of the work of the Holy Spirit. How does the Holy Spirit testify to Christ? How does the Holy Spirit guide us into truth? Welcome back. As we delve a bit deeper into this passage, I want to bring out three words that John, or that Jesus actually in this passage is talking about. And it says in verse 8 that when the Holy Spirit comes, he will prove the world to be wrong about sin and righteousness and judgment. Sin, righteousness, and judgment. Now, those are three very important words, and they're good theological words. And often, I think so often we've kind of misunderstood what some of them are. But in this passage, Jesus kind of unpacks them a bit, but he unpacks them in such a way that I don't think makes them any clearer. Let's have a look at each of them. Firstly, he says about sin, because people do not believe in me. Now that's a strange connection. What has sin got to do with believing in Jesus? And I think this, to unpack this concept here, what we need to realize is that sin really only has meaning in relationship with Jesus. Okay? You can't say to somebody who's not a Christian, somebody who's not in relationship with God, that they sin, because there is no point in sin. Sin is about how we reduce or break relationship. And the main relationship we're talking about here is the relationship with God through Jesus Christ. So therefore, what he's trying to say here is that the Holy Spirit will lead you into understanding what does it mean to sin, as in, what are you doing that's reducing or breaking the relationship with Jesus? That's where it says that you need to believe in him. I mean, in the same way that he says earlier on in the passage, and still in the end of chapter 15, he says that in fact, they have seen what I've done, and therefore there's no excuse for their sin. There's an excuse for the sin if we're not in relationship. It's hard to tell people who, in fact, who don't follow Christ that they're sinning. In fact, it's ridiculous to say that because they're living by a different set of rules, a different set of perspectives. In fact, what we've got to say is, what does it mean for us? And you know, the interesting thing then is that sin becomes less about a litany of different things that we've done and more become the reality of what anything we do that actually reduces or diminishes or breaks relationship with Jesus. And so that's the word sin. And we need to unpack that in terms of the concepts of relationship rather than the concepts of actions. The second word is the word righteousness. And this one is even more complicated to understand in terms of what Jesus says. He says about righteousness, because I'm going to the Father where you can see me no longer. What does that mean? Well, essentially what it means is it's about what we do when Jesus isn't watching. In a sense, there's that if Jesus isn't there, if we're not seeing what he's doing, how does what we do then reflect what we should be doing? You know, too often in terms of righteousness, we think of righteousness as being pious. It's a piety or purity. But in fact, righteousness is not about piety or purity. It's actually about the way in which we live our lives, that we live our lives in a way that shows forth who Christ is in us. That even though he's not there, that in fact, we might not see him as such, that still we will then seek to do the things that he's called us to do. Essentially, are we living in a way that actually lives out as if he's with us? I mean, if he's living alongside us as the Holy Spirit is, it's the Holy Spirit then that guides us to say, no, we need to be working or living or doing or being in the way that he's called us to be. Third word is the word judgment. And this is an interesting word. It says about judgment, because the prince of this world now stands condemned. Now, that's an interesting one. The prince of this world now stands condemned. It means, therefore, that we don't have to do judgment. We don't have to judge the prince of this world. We don't have to judge the people of this world. We don't even have to judge the things that they do, because in fact, the things that they do have already been judged, have already been condemned. You know, too often what I think happens with Christians is that we somehow think that we've got to be the moral police of our world, that we've got to be the ones who offer judgment to our world and tell them if they don't turn, they're going to burn. But in fact, this passage says it's not for us. That judgment has already been made. And you know, I think that changes the way in which we deal with our world. Is that instead of dealing with our world by offering it judgment, instead we need to offer it love and compassion, so that maybe, in fact, that judgment may be overturned, that condemnation may be overturned, that in fact we might win back that lost sheep. Rather than condemning the sheep for what it does, instead we can love the sheep so that it may be forgiven and restored and renewed and brought back into the vine again. And so I love those three words. And in a sense, Jesus's reinterpretation, or at least wanting to tell us what the interpretation is that, of those sin and righteousness and judgment. Because essentially what he's saying is that if they're going to hate us, then we need to act in such a way that's going to change their reaction. And even if it doesn't change the reaction, we've still got to live according to what we believe. I'd like us to discuss those three words. What does that mean for us in a practical level? What does it mean for us in a day-to-day connection, in the way in which we deal with those sin and righteousness and judgment? Welcome back. In our last section today, I want us to look at an application. And particularly, I want to look at really what permeates this whole passage, and that's the concept of persecution. I'm not sure that this passage would be a great advert to try and become a Christian. In verse 18, it says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. Yes. And then in verse 20, it says, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. That's not the land of milk and honey. That's not, kind of become a Christian and all things will be great. In fact, what it's saying is that we need to realize that there's pushback from the world. Then when we try to act in the world in a way which is loving and compassionate and kind and forgiving, that it's not just going to be that the world's going to open up its arms and say, yes, oh, please, we're so sorry that we wronged you. In fact, what we're going to do is to get the pushback from our world saying, we don't want you. We want to pursue our values. We want to pursue our things. We want to do what we want. And all that you're doing is showing up our lack of connections with each other. I think that when we see that, we realize that we need to respond how we respond to persecution. But you see, I think the first way in which we can respond to persecution is first of understanding what persecution is. Often the church has thought of itself as being persecuted, sometimes by materialism or by secularism or by some of these neo-atheists who kind of come against the church and against the church's beliefs. That's not persecution. To a large degree, in a lot of that, we actually bring upon ourselves. And we bring it upon ourselves because a lot of our own people don't understand what Christianity is. We also bring it upon ourselves when we look at the church's history and realize that there's so many times in our church's history that actually we weren't doing the things that God was calling us to do anyway. That's not persecution. What is persecution? Persecution is when we seek out the hand of compassion and love and kindness and forgiveness, and it gets slapped away and says, no, we don't want that. Persecution is the times when, in fact, we seek to share Christ's love with others, and in fact, we get hate in return. What do we do then? How do we respond to that? Well, of course, we've had the previous section in the first 17 verses of chapter 15 that tells us that one way we deal with that is by remaining connected to the vine. Is that we do that by being a community of God. Of course, the danger of that is that too often we can, in fact, love our community so much that we withdraw from our world. And we've seen that through the history of Christianity, where you have groups of Christians who, in fact, are so scared of the world around them that they become a little enclave, put up big walls so that, in fact, the world won't penetrate, won't come and hurt them with their persecution. In fact, the truth of it is that if that's what we do, then how on earth do we ever testify to Christ? The reality, too, is that what this passage is trying to tell us is that the Holy Spirit will enable us, will help us, will encourage us, will strengthen us to go actually and tell the things of Christ to others, even in the midst of their hate, even in the midst of their disagreement with us. I think persecution is still real. I think persecution in this world at the moment is somewhat subtler than it may have been during the Roman period. Yes, we're not going to be cast before actual lions. But the truth of it is that we are cast before figurative lions who are wanting to undermine Christianity, who want to undermine our message, who want to transform the church into the world's image. In fact, who want to transform Jesus into just another worldly prophet. I think that that's where the Holy Spirit can come and enable us and encourage us. As we finish this section together, I'd like you to discuss maybe the ways in which we may experience persecution today. And how can we respond to that persecution?